Dear students, colleagues, and distinguished guests, on this wonderful day celebrating St. Nicholas and the graduation of class 2023, it's our pleasure and a great honor to welcome a very special guest and lecturer within Philosophy University already, and this is Professor Rичард А.Вернер. I would like now to give the floor to the rector of Philosophy University, Professor Boris Velchev, for a welcoming speech.
Honorable Mr. Speaker of the Bulgarian Parliament, dear guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, I'm not going to deliver a speech because this is the job of Professor Werner. He'll be doing it much better than I could possibly do. But I want to thank him for this wonderful opportunity. First of all, to have him on our academic staff, and second, for the chance of listening to his first public lecture in Bulgaria. I know that probably his lecture will provoke some comments. I welcome that. It is very good to know that universities are islands of freedom, both freedom of thought and freedom of expression, and science needs freedom. So, while his lecture will be, I'm sure, very interesting, I just hope that it will not be directed and useful only to our students, but also to the general public and also to the policymakers in Bulgaria, because I am sure that Professor Werner has a lot to say. Thank you very much. A lot to say that would be even useful for the Bulgarian Parliament. And the Speaker of the Parliament is here, so we made our best to convey what Mr. Werner has to say to the Bulgarian Parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to give the floor to Professor Werner.
There are a few words that I want to say about Professor Werner. He was born in Germany, and he holds a first-class honours in Bachelor of Science in Economics from London School of Economics, and also a PhD in Economics from the University of Oxford. He has also studied at the University of Tokyo, and he is currently a member of Linacre College, Oxford, and a university professor in banking and finance at Winchester University. Since October 2023, he is also a full-time professor of Philosophy University, leading the newly accredited master program in international banking and finance. Until February 2019, he was for many years a member of ECB Shadow Council, and in 2008, he founded and he has been director of the Center for Banking, Finance and Sustainable Development, which is the first center to focus on the link between the financial sector and sustainability issues. He has been also a university lecturer of economics, banking and finance in a number of universities, including Goethe University, Frankfurt, the University of Southampton, De Montfort University, Sophia University, and a number of other prestigious universities. It's an interesting fact that in 1992, Richard proposed the disintegration of credit and its impact on asset markets and growth with his quantitative theory of credit. In 1995, he advanced the concept of quantitative easing in Japan, and his book, Princess of the Yen, was a #1 bestseller in Japan, beating Harry Potter for 6 weeks. In its English edition of 2003, he warned of the coming creation of credit bubbles and banking crisis in the Eurozone. So the World Economic Forum in Davos selected him as a global leader for tomorrow in 2003. Today he will speak, and his topic will be focused on sustainable economic growth without inflation and crisis. Professor Werner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia, for the kind introduction. President of the National Assembly, Rector, and also esteemed colleagues and students and members of the public. It's an honor to speak to you here. Julia mentioned previously as one of my prior universities. In fact, it was the first proper academic position. Previously at Oxford, I was only a doctoral researcher at the Institute of Economic Statistics, but my first professorial appointment as assistant professor was at Sophia University. Sophia University, Tokyo. There is such a university. It's a Christian university, actually a Jesuit university, and the Jesuits like this concept of wisdom. And in the Japanese name, you have the characters, the Chinese characters for wisdom, jochi in Japanese, but in English they use the Greek origin concept of wisdom. So it's a great pleasure to once again be affiliated and a member of a university that has Sophia wisdom connected to it. And of course, here we specialize particularly on the role of the financial sector. And of course, that will be an important theme that I'd like to talk about. High growth, prosperity is possible in almost any country. So why aren't we getting it in more countries? Now, of course, policymakers follow the advice of the experts. And the experts are economists, trained at the so-called leading universities in the world. I myself, as Julia mentioned, have been trained undergraduate London School of Economics, doctoral degree at Oxford. But what I learned there, I must say, did not actually prepare me to give proper and good policy advice. Because this was the mainstream official narrative economics. And that's one thing you have to start to realize. And as a student, it's very difficult because you, certainly in those universities, I was only given one side of the story. It was only one view. In fact, we did not study methodology. We did not study the history of economic thought. There was no awareness. Nobody was told that actually there are different approaches. There are wholly different types of economics that come to different recommendations. They didn't tell us. They only taught us one approach. And certainly what I've done in my lectures in my career is to make students aware, okay, there is this approach. It's dominant in the English language countries. But there are alternatives, and you need to understand what you're learning here with the English language historical, economics that's still dominant, propagated from the United States of America, is a certain type of economics based on a certain type of approach and certain type of assumptions. It used to be actually a very minor, marginal, extreme view in the past, but it's become dominant, and there are other approaches. So let's look at those today, because what is the track record of economics and of economists? And many people involved with this university, either as teachers and scholars or students, are actually interested in the real world. And they want to learn practical things that are useful. And also we want to be able to give good, sound policy advice to the policy makers, the decision makers for the country. So what is the state of play? What is the frontier in economics, and what is the track record in economics? And now I'm referring to the mainstream dominant English language economics as taught in Oxford, at Harvard, at MIT. And this was actually revealed recently, was admitted recently in an article in a journal that's considered the top journal, top rated, American journal, published in 2018. And they told us, it's rare that they make such admissions, they told us what is the state of play in economics, in macroeconomics. It's this article by two professors from Stanford University, again considered one of the leading universities in the world, but very much teaching the mainstream economics. And in this article, the two professors tell us many of the main empirical questions in macroeconomics are the same as they've been since at least 100 years ago, the Great Depression, the late 20s. And what are these questions that today macroeconomists are still asking because they have no answers? Number one, what causes business cycles? Number two, how does monetary policy work? Number three, how does fiscal policy work? Number four, why do some countries grow much faster and do much better and other countries don't? And obviously these are important questions. But they admitted that they still don't have the answers. And then this remark is also very telling. The next sentence is, those new to our field, i.e., people that have not yet been indoctrinated in economics, those new to our field may be tempted to ask, how can it be, how is it possible that after a whole century later, we're still asking the same questions? Indeed, indeed. Now those who've been, students of theirs, maybe they don't ask this question anymore. But we should ask that question. So can it really be true that the mainstream macroeconomics has made no progress in over a century? And of course we know that we have made significant progress in the past century in almost all the other fields. In physics, in chemistry, in biology, in engineering, in various applied sciences. We've made significant progress. Technological advances are impressive, breathtaking. But what about economics? There seems no progress. Now, I want to highlight today particularly development economics as that branch of economics whose explicit task it is to tell people how to develop an economy and get growth, prosperity, improve quality of life and standard of living. Now, if you go to a bookshop and you get development economics textbook, in the beginning, sometimes they tell you about the history of development economics. And I was amazed to see this, and I've taught development economics, I've used these textbooks, and they say, oh, development economics is a new discipline, relatively new. It started in the 1950s and 60s. And why? They say, oh, that's because many countries were decolonialized and they became independent, leaving the British Empire and the various, colonial rulers, and they became their own countries. And so this is a remarkable admission. Think about this for a moment. That's when the colonial masters decided, oh, we now need something like development economics. Why? Well, because all these countries are becoming independent. Hang on. Are you saying that as colonial rulers, when you had 100% control of these countries and the policies, you were not even interested in developing them? You didn't need development economics. And you're telling us now that they're becoming independent, you're really interested in their best interests and really want to give them good advice? If so, why haven't you done it and implemented it before? They should be well on their way to be developed by now. And should we trust this development economics that's handed to these countries as they become independent by the former colonial masters? Quite astonishing. Let's look at this development economics. Of course, it is well known, and it is internationally recommended, advanced, and you can even say forced on the more than 100 countries that are considered developing economies by the international organizations, particularly the ones based in Washington. So therefore, among scholars, it's known as the Washington Consensus set of development policies, because the Washington-based institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, US aid, the Inter-American Development Bank, the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve, all in Washington, have the biggest impact on these policies. And we can identify their recommendations. These recommendations are enforced as conditionality for loans and support from these international organizations. And what are they? Well, we can boil it down to two sets of recommendations. Number one, free markets, free trade is the best, delivers economic growth and prosperity, we're told. Therefore, you need to deregulate, liberalize, and privatize, and be open to the world, and particularly foreign money, foreign investment should come in. That's a good thing. That argument is based both in terms of historical, development of thought, and also in terms of logic, on classical economics developed in England in the 19th century by David Ricardo and other economists that followed since, and of course the modern versions of that neoclassical economics, and the entire approach, which is really equilibrium-based economics of the deductive type. I'll come to that. And the second argument is, well, for growth, you need investment. For investment, you need money. And where's the money coming from? Oh, it has to come from savings. It's the savings argument. And developing countries, oh, they don't have enough savings. Well, to develop domestic savings, that will take years, decades. You have to kickstart this by borrowing money from abroad and have foreign investment coming in. That's a good thing. And that is based, of course, on their on the growth theories that were developed in the post-war era, Harold Domar, solo growth models. So let's have a look at the logic. So first of all, the theory of comparative advantage. It was created, proposed by David Ricardo. Who was he? He's known as the richest economist in history. In fact, he wasn't an economist. He was, and we will talk more about this because today is the day of bankers and banking. He was a banker in the city of London. One could perhaps more precisely say he was a fixed income securities trader and speculator who made his fortune with the insider trades done on the day of the Waterloo defeat of Napoleon's army. And he became what today would be a billionaire on that one day. And it seems he was one of the execution traders of the biggest player in the market, who wanted to spread his trades through other trusted people like David Ricardo. He built himself a little country house, as they say in England. We like to understate things in England. Of course, in Europe, you'd call it a schloss or a chateau or a palace. So his country house is today the residence of the Princess Royal. So, it must have been already then quite impressive. What else can we say about David Ricardo? Well, let's look at the historians of economic thought, such as Professor Blogg, who's very respected internationally. He says very clearly, it was Ricardo who literally invented the technique of economics. And with this, he means modern economics in the English language tradition as it still is dominant today. So it does go back to David Ricardo, particularly the deductive methodology. Now, taking a slightly more critical viewpoint, you will find people pointing out that, well, he's known as the one who started the Ricardian vice. Now, a vice is not a good thing. In religious texts, you will find the 7 vices. This is something very bad, actually. So what are the Ricardian vices? Well, it's the excessive use of abstract model building based on many unrealistic assumptions, or to quote verbatim an American professor, Skuzen, the use of false and misleading assumptions to, in inverted comma, prove the results one desires. Which is clearly not scientific, is it? So that is the methodology, or as the American professor Mayo said, Ricardo, the origin of the misapprehension upon which the whole of economic theory is based must be traced to David Ricardo. Now, he wasn't just a lone, very rich banker and economist who retired when he made his money at the age of 42 and then decided to create modern economics from his perspective as a billionaire in the richest country in the world that was also the #1 military and economic and political power in the world. He also influenced other thinkers. He influenced Malthus, James Mill, John Stuart Mill. These are great thinkers, great early economists of their day. How did he influence them? Well, he bankrolled them. He literally paid them to write what he wanted them to write, and particularly when it comes to the conclusions. Now, we mentioned methodology and the deductive methodology, and just to remind ourselves, what does that mean? Well, there's fundamentally two approaches to do science. Methodology is the science of doing science, and you can either take the inductive approach or the deductive approach. How do the natural scientists in physics, chemistry, biology, how do they work? I mean, they've been clearly successful. So what is their approach? They look at data, observations, they evaluate that, they formulate hypotheses, they test them again with data. It is empirical and data-based. Now, what is that approach called? Oh, that is the inductive approach. That is the inductive approach. So the scientific research methodology is the inductive method. But in economics, we don't use that. In economics, in the English language, we have been using very consistently the deductive methodology. And essentially, economics is the only discipline to do that. And with the deductive approach, it all depends on your specific axioms and assumptions, and you can create any theoretical, fictional world and come to any desired conclusion. And of course, this is the canonical framework used in economics. We start with the axiom that people are rational, utility-maximizing individuals that don't care about others, that have no social relations with anyone, that do not try to help anyone, that have no other desires than to maximize their own consumption and benefit. And also they cannot be influenced by others, and they will not influence others. In other words, things like advertising, marketing will not work because people are very rational and can't be influenced. Psychology, forget it. Google doesn't exist because obviously, a business model based on advertising is impossible. So it doesn't exist in this fictional world you're creating in the deductive approach. And of course, the population has already dropped to 0 in this fictional world because everyone died as a baby. Because everyone only looks after themselves, you see. And individuals that need others to look after them, well, tough luck. Now, this is the axiom. An axiom is something we know to be true, and therefore, conveniently, we don't have to check whether it is true. If we did check, we'd find it's not true. That is an axiom. To this axiom, we add assumptions that we will admit are not quite true, or not true at all, such as perfect information, complete markets, flexible, instantly adjusting prices, perfect competition, 0 transaction costs, infinite lives, you name it. These are the canonical assumptions to create the framework to then present mathematical models that come to conclusions that clearly cannot be applied in honesty to the planet we live on. They may describe a planet that's very, very different and clearly very far away from our solar system. And that is the problem. Of course, the economics taught and published in leading journals and at leading universities is a theoretical, fictional dream world where everything is optimal. Markets are optimal. By definition, therefore, any intervention, such as by the government or regulator, must be suboptimal. And that's how they prove that government intervention is bad. And therefore, we should leave everything to the market forces. And that is the nature of deductive economics. Here is Ricardo's specific theory of comparative advantage. Here's the list of assumptions. I'm not going to go through them, just to give you the impression. He makes a lot of assumptions and then creates this theoretical framework. And in that framework, he then proves that, he proves in inverted commas, that any country should open up to British exports. Remember, Britain was the first country to industrialize and have the Industrial Revolution, producing mass production and mass exports, but needed to persuade other countries to just open up to British imports. And his theory was very useful in that endeavor. But actually, celebrated this theory as, even today, as showing the advantages of international trade. But really, those advantages were already well known. The dominant thinking before Ricardo and the classical writers was the so-called mercantilist economics. The mercantilists knew international trade is good and beneficial. That's why they're called mercantilists. They believed in trading. So what was really new about Ricardo? Well, it is a bit of a puzzle because he only showed that trade can be beneficial. Will it really be beneficial to a small developing economy to open up willy-nilly to British goods? That is another question, because David Ricardo did not give the tools to give an honest answer to this. The mercantilists already knew that, yes, trade can be very beneficial, but you've got to watch out that also your country will get some of those benefits, because the distribution of the benefits is uneven and depends on some key factors, such as the terms of trade. And this distribution can be so bad that the rich countries will get all the benefit and the developing economies will not. And therefore, you have to take different policies. Particularly, the developing countries have been encouraged to export raw materials and import finished goods, when the mercantilists already knew by the 19th century that, in fact, they knew by the 17th century, that the way to prosperity and to prosper from international trade is the opposite, to make sure you import raw materials and export high-value added finished goods. But today, the IMF and the World Bank are preventing developing economies from taking those policies, and therefore they're preventing development. So Ricardo showed only in his theory of comparative advantage that trade can be beneficial, and the question of how the benefits will be distributed, what does he say about that? Precisely nothing. He says nothing about that. It is a big exercise in distracting your attention, like the magician on stage. Look here, while the tricks are done over here. Ricardo doesn't discuss the crucial questions of the distribution of the benefits. Now, empirical research has shown that, we know developing economies are mostly raw material exporters, but raw material exporters will suffer over time, inevitably, from declining terms of trade, which means they forever will get less for their exports of raw material and will have to pay more for their imports of finished goods. And therefore, net wealth will be extracted from them and they will not develop. They will stay poor and just be exploited as raw material exporters. That essentially is the reality. But we don't learn this from David Ricardo or English language, modern international economics. And of course, there are costs from trade as well, and you need to balance them, such as decline in self-sufficiency. That can be very problematic in times of disruption, war, blockade, blackmail, pandemics. So keeping food production local and energy production local is actually an important priority for countries in the real world. But you would not learn this from international economics the way it's taught. And of course, as a result, developing economies find that with their terms of trade getting worse, their balance of payments, the international balance, goes into the red. Their currency weakens and they have to borrow money from abroad. Now, we're told at the same time by the same type of economists, oh, that's a good thing, borrow money from abroad. So that's the second point. Let's look at that. I mean, we really found that it's not true what they're saying about comparative advantage. And the second point, the big point, is about money. But before that, just one intermediate point is this approach that's being used. Of course, you will know if you've done a little bit of economics, it's all about equilibrium. And for those who have not studied economics, here is a 1-minute crash course. Essentially, there's only one diagram, one graph that we have in economics. Here it is. It's in price and quantity space. We have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. And in this framework, of course, where the two curves intersect, that's the point of equilibrium. Prices are key because they drive us to equilibrium. They move and we get to equilibrium. So in equilibrium economics, they love to talk about prices. Now this is used in any market. The market for very specific local micro market for second-hand BMWs in Sofia, for example. But it can be for a whole country, for the automobile industry. But it can be used for the FX market. It can be used for the labor market. It's used for everything. And the assumptions also apply. Because, you see, you have to read the small print. We don't read the small print nowadays because every day we're forced several times to click that you've read the terms and conditions, right? Who has actually read them? So we're being forced to lie, essentially. Nobody has time to read all these terms and conditions. Well, here's terms and conditions of this equilibrium economics. You will only get equilibrium, and prices will only be important and dominant if and only if at least 8 assumptions, the canonical assumptions of equilibrium economics, apply. Namely, perfect information. Everyone already knows everything. You don't have to come to this lecture, for instance. Complete markets for everything. Perfect competition. There's so many thousands of companies in every market that there's zero profits. I remember the earnings season when the analysts talk about corporate profits. Oh, zero again. All of them zero again. You remember that time? Right. Each time. That's what they're assuming. Instantaneous price adjustment all the time, zero transaction costs, no time constraints, profit maximization by rational agents that cannot be influenced by marketing, and so on. So in other words, that's pretty unrealistic, isn't it, these assumptions? If you take an actuarial insurance approach, because we have probability statisticians and mathematicians, you actually very quickly see through this. What is this world we're being told here about in economics? Does anyone recognize this picture? Yes, Alice in Wonderland, wonderful. And there she is, flying in Wonderland you can fly, of course. She's flying there with the Queen in Wonderland. And a very interesting conversation develops between Alice and the Queen. Alice laughed. There's no use trying, Alice says. One can't believe impossible things. Oh, the Queen disagrees. I dare say you haven't had much practice in believing impossible things. Why, when I was your age, Alice, I always did it for half an hour a day. What? Believing in impossible things. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Now, this is very important because we now learn that clearly Alice in Wonderland is not qualified as economist in the English language equilibrium tradition. She could not be a good economist. Impossible. But even the Queen in Wonderland, the expert in believing impossible things, could not be an economist. Why? Well, we know that you have to believe in not just 6 impossible things and not just before breakfast. No, you have to believe in 8 impossible things all the time. So what do the actuarial mathematicians working for the insurance companies who take a very pragmatic approach, what would they say? They would say, okay, these are very unrealistic assumptions. What's the probability that one assumption holds? Now, if we want to be super generous to the Ricardo approach, the deductive approach, where we make these assumptions. Let's say the probability is they're likely to be true. Probability is more than 50%. Let's say 55%. What these economists forget in their calculations, although they usually like to use mathematics, is that the joint probability applies here. So what is the probability we get equilibrium? Even if one assumption was more likely to be true than not, 55%. Well, we've got 8 of them. So the calculation is 0.55 to the power of 8. What is that? Is that a large number? Is that a high probability? It's less than 1%. And we know for sure that the actual probability of any of these assumptions to be true is not 55%. It's more like 0. Perhaps some people might give it 0.5%, or perhaps real optimists might go for 1%. But it doesn't matter. The outcome is always highly unlikely to ever give us equilibrium. So we know markets are not in equilibrium. Now, in English language bookshops, they separate books into fiction and non-fiction. If you go in there and you want an economics book, where's it going to be? Non-fiction. Well, how did that happen? Because we know that 95, 97% of economics books are about equilibrium. And that is pure fiction. There is no equilibrium. And there's never been empirical evidence of equilibrium in any market, let alone this general equilibrium the macroeconomists are presupposing. Central banks' models are general equilibrium models. That is taking the 0.8% to the power of 5,000 markets, all at the same time in equilibrium. Impossible. So, markets are rationed, and rationed markets follow a very simple principle, the short side principle. Whichever quantity, and it's all about quantities, whichever quantity of demand or supply is smaller determines the outcome, because that's the common denominator. And they have power. The short side has power, and so suddenly power enters economics. And anyone who's been in business knows power is real, market power, economic power is real. And only in the fictional equilibrium world don't you see it, but once you study realistic economics, you realize, once you study scientific economics, you realize, of course, power is there. The short side can pick and choose with who to deal. They can choose their counterparty. And that power, of course, in reality is often abused, and benefits are being extracted in all sorts of ways, often unethical ways. But that's the reality we need to be aware of, and students need to be aware of. I mean, just think about how Hollywood starlets are being recruited, because there's many applicants. The short side can pick and choose and extract whatever. That's the reality. What about money? What is the short side here? What is larger, the demand for money or the supply? What is smaller, the demand for money or the supply? What do you think? What is smaller, the demand for money or the supply? Yes, supply. Say it immediately. Exactly. It's obvious. We all like to have more money. When I was a student and at the LSE, and that they were showing the money demand function, which is the aggregation of everyone's individual demand for money. I thought that's pretty weird, because that seems pretty small to me. And all you guys, very modest people, but my demand for money is probably around there at infinity. And it's an aggregation of everyone's demand. So how can the aggregate demand be this small? It doesn't make sense. The reality is the supply side is the limiting factor. Demand is always exceeding supply, and the supply side has power. So who supplies money? And now we come to the crux. And on this day of bankers, it's time to reveal the biggest secret in the economy, which is the biggest secret in banking. Let's look at how banks work. So we've dismissed the first part, and let me just go to this banking part. Now, when you look at how banks work, and you are searching properly concerning theories of banking, you find actually, there's 3 theories of banking. You may only find, if you search superficially, the first one, the financial intermediation theory, because everyone nowadays is quoting that, whether it's often bankers themselves or central bankers. The textbooks, the journal articles in the leading journals, they're all the financial intermediation theory, which says that each bank is a financial intermediary, just gathering deposits, doing their analysis, and then lending out according to their credit and risk assessment. Just an intermediary, and therefore we don't really need to talk much about banks because they're just like other financial institutions, just like other non-banks. Banks are not special. That's the dominant view. There's an older theory that was dominant until the 1960s, known as the fractional reserve theory. Now that one has some similarities. It also says each individual bank is just an intermediary. They gather deposits and lend it out. But they say, hang on, there is something happening here, something strange that you should be aware of. As the banks interact, money is being created. And they even talk about a money multiplier, which should make your ears prick up. I mean, you'd think, okay, that's maybe important. And that's why since the 60s, we had the new theory, financial intermediation theory, which says, no, there's nothing to see here. Walk on. You don't need to look at banks. But actually, there is an older theory. It's the oldest, over 100 years old, the credit creation theory. And that has a very different view. That one says, no, banks are not financial intermediaries. Not in aggregate and not individually. Something else is happening. Well, these three theories differ in the question of when a bank gives a loan, where does the money come from? I mean, what do you think? If a bank gives a loan, where do they get the money from? Now, these three theories give you three different answers. The first two, we heard, the bank is an intermediary only and gathers deposits. So for the loan, the money somehow comes from other accounts, either the deposits or the fractional reserve theory actually says it comes from excess reserves at the central bank. That's how banks give you the money. Here are the three theories. You can see the timing. So the dominant one is only dominant since the 1960s, and the source of the money is deposits. Fractional reserve says it's the reserves. And what does the credit creation theory say? It says that the money doesn't come from anywhere. That usually then is put into Latin because it's perhaps slightly shocking. So we say ex nihilo. It's created out of nothing. And so therefore, what about money creation? Of course, in the dominant theory, there's no money creation, nothing to see here. The fractional reserve theory makes you aware that while each individual bank is an intermediary, in aggregate, something happens, there is money creation in the system. But the credit creation theory says, no, each time a bank gives a loan, it creates new money, each individual bank. And that's added to the money supply and therefore has tremendous macroeconomic implications that you should not ignore. And of course, based on which theory you believe in, your bank regulation would follow. Now, we all know we've got the Basel approach to bank regulation, which was designed to prevent banking crises in the 1980s. And it's worked really well. We've had no banking crises since. Oh, hang on, sorry, wait. Did we have banking crises? Since it was introduced, we've had more than 100 banking crises. So, actually, the Basel approach has not worked. Could it be because the underlying theory of how banks actually work is wrong? Well, it stands to reason. Now, what's the scientific thing to do? Since I'm interested in the scientific approach to economics, not the axiomatic, hypothetical, deductive approach where you basically make things up. The scientific approach is, well, there's three theories. What would a scientist do? Well, let's test them. Let's do an empirical test. And so it turned out it was the first empirical test of how banks work in the 5,000-year history of banking. Published, you can Google, can banks individually create money out of nothing? There's one, and the other one, Lost Century in Economics. I'll just give you the conclusion, and perhaps in questions and answers we can talk more about details. The result is, we found in this empirical test the financial intermediation theory is soundly rejected. I found a bank that would collaborate with me. I could look inside their black box, so to speak, their accounting, their IT system. if you take out a loan, I actually literally took out a loan, 200,000 euros, and I want to see what happens inside the bank. And where does this money come from? It did not come from deposits. Financial intermediation theory rejected. It did not come from reserves. They didn't even check their reserves. Rejected. It came from nowhere. It was newly created by the bank and credited to my account, and I could withdraw the money. That is what banks do. They create money. Now, this is actually apparent when you study law, particularly in the country that created modern banking, with the legal system in line with it, the country where the Bank of England was created in the 17th century. And in English law, it's very, very clear. Economists today claim banks are deposit-taking institutions that lend money. It's not true. And if you have an argument, you go to court. What matters is the law. And the law says banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. That is the legal reality. I'll explain. At law, and there is an unchallenged High Court ruling in England and other rulings coming to the same conclusion, a bank deposit doesn't even exist. There is no such thing as a bank deposit. It has no privileged status. It gives you the impression that somehow the money is held in custody, is held for you, like legally a bailment or warehousing. It is not. It is not privileged. It's simply a loan to the bank. A loan like any other commercial loan. You are giving a loan to a company that is a bank. That is the legal status. Okay, so banks don't take deposits because at law there is no such thing. But hang on, surely banks lend money. And as a borrower, you say, I don't care about these details, just give me the money for my loan. And if the banker is careful, the banker will respond, yes, we have credited your account with the money. They may casually say, we're transferring you the money to your account. That would be incorrect. And I could confirm that in my empirical test. No money is transferred from any other account, inside or outside the bank. It's newly created. Because, you see, the loan contract is a promissory note at law, a debt instrument that you issue by your signature. You've issued an IOU, a debt instrument, and the bank is in the business of purchasing securities. It's buying your promissory note. And it's then crediting you the money in your account, which at law simply is a record of the money the bank owes you. It's a chose in action, as the lawyers say in English law. You have a claim, but that's it. You don't own the money. Our money, if it's not cash or gold that you're holding, well, sorry, it's not your money. The banks own it if it's in the bank. That is the legal situation. And so deposits arise essentially as a rebooking of an accounts payable liability arising from the loan contract. And that's all bank deposits are. So that's the trade secret of banking. When you take a bank loan, say £1,000 here, the asset side of the balance sheet of banks increases because they now have a claim. And then they simply credit the borrower in their newly opened account with the money that they owe. And that's how money is created, because the bank deposits are our money supply. That's how 97% of the money supply is created. And that puts banks at the center of the economy. But you wouldn't know this if you study modern English language, deductive economics. Because when you make up this fictional dream world, you're not interested in institutions, and there are no banks. Banks are left out. Why? Well, they're not special. They're just intermediaries. They say by assumption. And so that's the big difference. So the standard concept of banks as intermediaries getting savings and then putting them into the economy, that is actually incorrect. Banks are creators of the money supply. They're very special. The decisions by banks, who to give new money and how much new money, therefore, to create, for what purposes, that decision will essentially reshape the economic landscape in the country where the banks are in a very short time period. The bankers determine the economic destiny of the country. And therefore, you need to have the right type of banks doing the right type of thing. But you see, the second argument in development economics was developing countries, they need to grow. Well, they don't have enough savings, so they need to borrow money from abroad. Well, that's not actually true, because they have banks. They can create their own money. And you don't need the savings first, because by creating credit for productive business investment, that's how you're creating the money supply and the deposits, which ex post are also savings, to fund economic growth. So the official development economics is false, but leads to a system where developing economies are actually prevented from developing. And that is why we have this empirical outcome. Which developing countries have actually ever developed based on the Washington consensus policies that are being propagated by the IMF and the World Bank for already 70 plus years? So name a country that has successfully developed based on these policies. How many countries are there? Exactly, 0. There are none. There is not a single one. Now, that doesn't mean that no country has developed. Which countries have successfully developed in the 20th century? We do have examples. There is a handful of countries, but they're all in East Asia. They are Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and most recently, last 4.5 decades, China. They've delivered spectacular double-digit economic growth, lifting millions out of poverty. How did they do this? Not by following the IMF and World Bank advice. Instead, by adopting policies forbidden by the IMF and the World Bank. Japan announced in the 60s a doubling of the national income plan. Initially, lots of criticism also from Washington, that's too ambitious. They wanted to double their national income in 10 years. Well, they did it after 4.5 years. Why? With 10% economic growth, your national income doubles every 7 years. They had 15% economic growth. You double it after 4.5 years. This was the era of high growth in Japan. Korea, also 2 decades of double-digit growth. China, 4 decades of double-digit economic growth. What were the policies? Well, for Western economists, it's been an economic miracle because they can't explain it in their deductive framework. And the policies, when you examine actually what policies were taken, they are the ones that are forbidden by the IMF and Washington consensus institutions. So the official narrative is contradicted by the reality that countries have developed and regions have developed successfully if they followed very different policy advice, not based on deregulate, liberalize, privatize, use foreign money. They didn't use foreign money. They used bank credit creation for productive business investment, and then you get high economic growth. This has been demonstrated in Manchuria in the 1930s, then in Japan from 1937 onwards, Taiwan, Korea, and China. But actually in history earlier on, this is how Germany developed 150 years ago or so. England from the 15th to the 18th century, and the US in the 19th century, very successfully. You have trade policy, industrial policy, conscious institutional design, especially bank-based finance, and guidance of bank credit by the central bank to make sure bank credit is used for productive business investment. Because really, and this is the key insight here that you should take home with you, there's 3 possibilities when a bank gives a loan. Bank credit creation can be used for these 3 possible ways, but they have different consequences, only one of which is good. If banks give a loan for somebody to purchase an existing asset, real estate or financial asset, or even loans for an M&A or private equity fund to buy another company, this is money creation for purchasing existing assets. That can't be good because, you see, you're creating money, you're exerting an impact on the economy, you're adding to the money supply for doing what? There's no creation of a new income stream to service and repay the loan. What you get is asset bubbles. You're driving up the collateral values. You get these asset inflation periods. They can be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Everyone thinks we're doing great. Asset prices are rising. and the assets are the collateral for the banks. But these asset prices have been boosted by the banks through the credit for unproductive asset purchase use. And therefore, the moment the music stops, when the banks stop lending for asset purchases, that market is going to crash. The late-coming speculators crash first. They don't get the capital gains they expected. They can't service and repay their loans. They default. The banks have non-performing loans. The banks reduce lending to the sector. Asset prices fall, and the whole thing becomes a downward spiral. Now, once you push the assets up 100%, 200%, 300%, it usually happens in these asset bubbles. From the peak, they just need to drop by 15%, and your banking system is bust because equity is usually 10% or less. That's why we have the recurring banking crises. Regulators can easily prevent that. They just need to watch what is bank credit creation used for? What is the credit allocation? If bank credit is used for consumption, now that's obvious. You get inflation, consumer price inflation, because bank credit is money creation. And if it's for consumption, you're stimulating demand, consumption, but you haven't increased goods and services. So you've got the same stock of goods and services, but more demand. Of course, you're going to push up consumer prices. That's also unsustainable. The redeeming feature of banking is the green box. And if you make sure you have that type of bank lending, you get high growth, no inflation, and you get prosperity. That is bank credit for productive business investment to increase the productive capacity of the economy, usually by funding entrepreneurs that have ideas that add value, implement new technologies, increase productivity. Then you get more goods and services of higher value, and you can do almost as much of that as you want. There's almost no limit. And you will get growth without inflation, without crises. Abundance and prosperity is possible, and that is what they did in East Asia. They had credit guidance where the central bank stopped consumer credit and suppressed credit for asset purchases and made sure bank credit went into the green box. And within there, you could also prioritize those industries where it's the highest value added, important technologies are implemented, maybe export production was favored as well, and so on. And you get very high economic growth, 15% growth can be done in any country. And the trade pattern you will then also get is importing raw materials and exporting finished goods, which means your balance of payments will be positive. And already the mercantilists knew that. That is the secret for economic success. So we've basically seen this now. And with this, you can explain all the past crises we had in Europe and Japan here, the asset bubble of the 80s, bank credit in aggregate way ahead of GDP growth. That was the bubble. Then the central bank stopped the game. The banks go bust, and you have a 20-year recession if you want. You could have ended it very quickly by getting rid of the bad debts in the banking system and forcing bank credit up, but the central bank refused to do that. In Europe, we had, from 2004 onwards, we had bank credit expanding rapidly in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, 20, 30, 40% bank credit growth, way ahead of GDP growth, so clear creation of asset bubbles, which had to lead to banking crises, as I warned, and then recessions, unemployment, entirely avoidable. The ECB is a very fair central bank, having caused this pandemonium for the periphery countries. It then moved on from 2009 to create an asset bubble in Germany by forcing the banks to increase bank lending for property speculation. The property bubble has just been ended late last year. So we know that in the next 3 years, we'll have a banking crisis in Germany and other central European countries. So it's always the same game, you see. If you look at bank credit creation, then you see what's going to happen. This is the window guidance, credit quotas for banks. And it's a very powerful tool. And you should use it for good purposes, for the development of the country, and you can. The central bank easily can do that. Because I press the button, you see the actual bank lending 3 months later. This is Japanese data. It's the most powerful macroeconomic tool in existence. That explains the East Asian economic miracle. But of course, if you don't want to have window guidance, credit guidance for productive business investment, you can still get the same result if you have the right types of banks. And that is creating many small banks. That's exactly what China did. when Deng Xiaoping came to power, it's interesting, he started with methodology. He started his first speech in 1978 saying, let's talk about methodology. And I'm paraphrasing, but essentially that's what he said. There's two methodologies. There's the deductive one based on making stuff up, ideology. And of course, in his case, it was the communist ideology. In Western countries, it's the classical, neoclassical ideology. And he said, listen, guys, let's forget about ideology. Let's not argue about such things. Let's just look at the facts and the reality. Liberate your thinking from ideology. Seek truth from facts, is the four-letter, four-character expression he used. That is the inductive scientific research methodology. He wanted to know what actually works. He went to Japan in '78, and he found out the secret of high economic growth. And as a result, he moved away from the Soviet monobank system with one bank, and he created thousands of banks. Thousands of banks, small banks, local banks, savings banks, credit unions, village banks, provincial banks, thousands. And they lend for productive business investment. That's how you get decades of high economic growth. So we're in the situation now where in communist China, the leader already 45, 50 years ago said something like, hey, let's not do this ideological stuff, the deductive approach. Let's be pragmatic and scientific and empirical. So he was, of course, being a radical in China, but it remains revolutionary in Western economics because they still follow their ideology, the deductive approach that we have to liberate ourselves from. And so let me conclude. How do we get high economic growth? How can we have a more equitable society? How can we increase the quality of life and the standards of living? How can we avoid concentration of economic benefits in the city? And how can we strengthen the regions? Well, you know the answers now. The empirical record shows that when you create many small banks and you have local banks, credit unions, cooperative banks, savings banks, local public savings banks in the villages, and they create credit for small businesses, because it's empirically shown that big banks do big deals with big businesses, but employment is with small firms. I mean, we don't have time to look into this, but you see, that's why Germany was successful. 80% of the German banks are small local banks. 70% by deposits, 80% by number of banks are cooperative local banks and local public savings banks. And that's why Germany is more successful than any country in terms of exports per capita. Until 2009, in absolute terms, more exports than China. And of course, China, population 30 times as large. But also these small firms that are so ubiquitous in Germany, these small firms are internationally very successful. They're known as hidden champions. Champion because they have, you know, like the Olympics, gold, silver, bronze. They have top 3 market shares, number 1, 2, 3 market share, champion. But hidden because they're small, medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. So you don't know the name. They're unknown. They're hidden champions. And if you look at the number of hidden champions in the world, Germany is head and shoulder above any other country. And therefore, the economy is very successful and resilient because small firms create a lot of jobs. 70% of employment in every country, at least, is with small firms. They need money. Where do they get it from? Why are they so successful? Because they have their local banks that only lend to the local area, to small firms in the local area. And that creates jobs in the villages, in the regions, in the countryside. And not just any jobs, you can be very successful internationally because these small firms did not invent new technologies, no, but they immediately got the new money to implement the new technology. When a new technology comes on the market, they go to their local bank and say, if we don't get this, we'll fall behind. They had the money by the next day to get those technologies and thrive as a business. So that's what we need to do. We need to create small firms, small banks to support the small firms. And we can do this. And of course, you have to be ready for the real world and leave the Alice in Wonderland of fictional economics. And of course, that is why we are launching the new master's degree in international banking and finance, which will be based on this methodology and philosophy and vision that we need to be practical. And of course, this, I think, is the right university to do it, because it's always been very practice-oriented and very reality-oriented. But I think we can really now expand the impact that we have with this university, because the whole world, I think, needs to learn about this approach. And of course, the masters will be offered internationally. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we'll have time for questions now. Thank you.
Dear Professor, thank you very much for your speech. It was quite interesting, and nevertheless, there are few questions raising from your statements, and some of them are debatable. I'm very impressed. I hope that the audience is impressed as well. I apologize myself because I have to leave now, but thank you very much for the spirit and this forgotten by me feeling of being student. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day and the questions. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl.
So, question time. Any questions? Yes, Mr. Baramov? Do you have a microphone, please? Anyone? Just.
Yes, thank you. I would like to express my most sincere gratefulness for the very impressive presentation of Mr. Werner. It is definitely allowed me to have another very different perspective on a field that I have studied for many years, of economics. And I found two points of your presentation especially interesting, and therefore I have two questions. So could you elaborate further your view based on this approach on the topic about the importance of central banks? Because from what I got, it's basically the massive power is actually into commercial banks, the small banks. And talking about them is my second question. In your view, what is the balance, so to say, the number of banks to, I'm not sure how to formulate the question, to let's say to larger cities, or to the number of companies, if you get what I'm asking. So yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this question. I have not actually talked much about central banks. I'm really grateful for this question, which is an important one. What is the balance of power, and what's the proper role of central banks? First of all, central banks are a fairly new phenomenon, created mostly in the last 200 years. Some countries created a central bank only 23 years ago, like the European small country called Luxembourg. They didn't have a central bank until the ECB was founded, and the ECB told them, no, you have to have a central bank, otherwise Luxembourg, we're not sure you can actually stay in the Eurozone. So they founded a central bank. So you see, it's possible to do well even without a central bank. The United States of America, still so far, for the majority of its history, did not have a central bank. The Federal Reserve is the recent development. Only 110 years ago it was founded, against much resistance. There were brief periods of prior attempts by private interests to create a privately owned central bank, as the Federal Reserve banks still are. And so as you look into the history of central banking, it is important to realize that all the central banks in the past, before the 20th century, were privately owned. So the central banks were privately owned. And even now, many central banks are still privately owned, like the US Federal Reserve banks. And, you know, it's a Federal Reserve system. There's a political board in Washington, but the real action, as everyone knows in the markets, is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That is doing the real actual monetary policy. All the open market operations, interventions in the markets is New York, and that's 100% privately owned. The Bank of England was officially privately owned until 1946. Its current status is somewhat curious, let's say, but anyway, for the majority of its history, it was privately owned. So that also gives you food for thought, because a central bank clearly is very powerful, because it has power over banks, and therefore it has power over the entire economy. And power, particularly concentrated power, always has this risk that it gets abused. Somebody who's been involved in policy making and decision making on a national level and advising decision makers is Lord Acton, already in the 19th century, late 19th century, and he had this famous phrase that power corrupts. So anyone who has power will essentially experience temptations, you know, where you can take advantage of that power. And the reality is a lot of people cannot resist that temptation. And then when you have very much power, the more power you have, like absolute power, exactly, that's his famous phrase, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. And that's, of course, why we have to be very cautious in general about introducing, creating central banks. They would need to be very accountable to the people and to the public. But in the last 40 years, central banks have become independent from governments and in reality unaccountable. And that, as I've warned, is usually a bad thing. We're suffering from regulatory moral hazard, where central banks and central planners benefit from crises, because each time there's a crisis, they manage to persuade people we need to give them more powers, because that's how we avoid the next crisis. But actually, that's how we make sure we'll get another crisis, because they'll get more powers each time. So the fact is, we don't, strictly speaking, need central banks. If you have one, well, then make sure it's accountable. That may be quite hard. The ECB system, even for countries that are not part of the Eurozone yet, they're required to have an independent central bank. But I think there are ways one can increase accountability, such as transparency and knowledge about how things work, how banks work. And the public and parliament should make demands on central banks to be accountable and deliver results. And we should certainly ask central banks more to do what is their job, because they have the overall picture of where the money is going, how much money is created, what purpose it's used for. And if it's not mainly going for productive purposes, well, the central bank should stop the bad activities and should encourage productive business investment. Of course, the central planners have actually done the opposite. And that's a matter of public record. The Basel system of bank regulation punishes the good productive banks, the small local banks that lend for productive business investment. They're being punished because they get a high so-called risk weight for business loans. And if you instead fund property speculation, you get a lower risk weight. You need to have less capital. It's more profitable. So since the Basel regime was introduced, we get more and more property lending, and we get these boom-bust cycles of asset booms and crises. So the regulators have been on the wrong track. And so we definitely need to step up our vigilance there. And of course, there is the topic of CBDC. Central bankers are now aiming to further increase their power by having central bank digital currencies, which is a control tool that gives them absolute power. And that's to be avoided. Also, it will kill banks, there's no doubt. Already, the central bankers have taken policies to concentrate banking systems and force them to merge, forcing out the good small banks, which are much better for the economy. It's better to have many, many small banks. So that's maybe also the answer to the question of the sort of balance. The more banks you have, the better in general, and the more small banks you have, you know, the even better. Sorry, who was first? Yeah, maybe.
Okay. I would like to ask you, thank you very much for an extremely insightful lecture. Indeed, thank you. Indeed, you clarified so many conundrums for us. So thank you very much for that. It's now clear for us, I think for everybody, it's clear what needs to be done. But how is this being done in the countries that you mentioned, in China, in Korea? How was this system implemented? You mentioned that there were certain regulations that set some limits on loans for properties, for commercial loans. This was imposed by whom? By the central bank?
The central bank, yes. It was run, the credit guidance is run in most countries by the central bank. But in China, the central bank is not independent from the government. And it actually works very closely with the government. And these decisions apparently were made together with the so-called Banking Commission, which exists outside the central bank and is a bit of a watchdog also of the central bank and is certainly involved in determining the window guidance, credit guidance, the quantity quotas on bank loans. So it's possible for government to establish such an agency to monitor what banks and central banks are doing and ensure a better allocation of bank credit. Also, I think we need to reform the Basel capital adequacy approach, which misallocates resources, basically.
So basically, it is the government that needs to have this perspective and needs to have this policy, and the government, through the central bank, would impose this kind of regulations. Because if the central bank is left on its own, it's not going to do that.
Precisely, exactly. Now, a good example, a concrete, practical example in Europe is Hungary, where we have a country like Bulgaria that still has its own currency, which is a good thing. That is not just national sovereignty. It also gives any country more options over economic policies. And it ensures that policymakers can implement the right and good policies, and you're not dependent on a central bank abroad. You know, if you've got your own currency, you've got your own economic destiny at hand. The euro is a foreign currency for every member country. So Hungary has its own currency, that's a good thing. And the central bank, because they're in the EU, they had to sign the same treaties, and the central bank had to be made also independent. But they managed to, in reality, work very closely with the government. And the central bank has some form of guidance of bank credit. I mean, I started to talk to the central bank already 10 years ago. They were very open to this, and they introduced programs already 10 years ago to boost bank credit to small firms. That's been a big agenda at the Hungarian central bank, and the economy has done really well. They've had high economic growth. You know, there's some things where they joined other central banks. They also had inflation in the last few years, which was actually not created by commodities prices, oil prices, energy prices, but by central bank policies. But it's one of the best central banks at the moment, I would say, and they work very closely with the government for the reasons you mentioned. You need that cooperation.
And another question, if you allow me. You have been involved in the sustainability agenda. It is now very topical. How does it fit into all this picture that you paint? How should the sustainability agenda and policies be promoted in a way to be beneficial finally to the economy?
Yes. Now, of course, it's very important when we discuss sustainability to make sure we talk about the same things. And I think most people, and I'm sure everyone in this room, will agree that number one priority is to protect the environment and be good stewards of the planet, taking care of nature, animals, and not harm or destroy the environment and not deplete resources so that it's, you know, there's huge cost from that. Sometimes it could be irreplaceable. So I think we agree on that, and that should really always be the focus. But what I see when I look at a lot of countries where we have leaders that say, oh, we really support sustainability, and they take a lot of so-called green policies, sometimes it's very strange what they're doing. In Canada, they're still cutting down hundreds and hundreds, entire forests of these giant, 2,000-year-old giant trees. They're still cutting them down. How can that be? And they talk about let's have green policies. And then we see in Germany, they're cutting down entire forests in order to then put in place wind generators, wind power plants, or photovoltaic panels. And they cut down an entire forest for that. Or in Berlin, they cut down a forest for Tesla to build its battery factory. And so this is all very concerning to me, because that shows this is somehow is not working. That's not really what it's about. So first of all, what is the link between sustainability and economic growth? Because there is also this movement out there that says, it's called the degrowth movement. It says, no, we don't want economic growth. Economic growth is bad because it hurts the environment. And that we need to quickly think about this, because it's a fundamental question. And of course, I am saying we can have very high growth. Also in Bulgaria, we can have 10% growth, 15% growth, and very equitable prosperity for society. It is feasible. It can be done. We just need the right practical policies, which will involve banking and monetary policies. So growth is good in my view. But hang on, I'm also very much in favor of protecting the environment. So what is the link? Well, economic growth is not the enemy of the environment. The enemy of the environment is environmental destruction. Let's say the degrowth movement, which is anti-growth, they're saying we should have zero growth, then that's good for the environment. Well, hang on, let's say we have zero growth now. Can environmental destruction still happen? Yes, exactly. And it does happen in Canada, where the government is saying, oh, we're very much in favor of green policies. And they're cutting down all these ancient, huge, giant trees and forests. Unbelievable. So you see, there is actually no direct link between growth and the environment. They're separate things. And you can prove that economic growth itself cannot even be harmful for the environment. The proof is that what is growth? It's a statistical concept. It's a statistical fiction. It's not even real. Now, it's an important fiction, and our system is actually very much geared for this fiction, and the fiction is very closely linked to banking, and the history of GDP, national income accounting, is very closely connected with banking, because it was created for the bankers to check the ability to pay on sovereign lending. But the economic growth as such is not the problem, because it's just a statistical fiction. So you can have high growth and a lot of protection of the environment. You can have low growth and maybe a lot of harm to the environment, because empirically we find that when countries are doing well, everyone is willing to put more emphasis on environmental protection. We see it with China. Once they became more developed and prosperous, they said, yeah, we want to protect the environment. They made it an important priority.
So what would be a sensible policy, sustainability policy? How would it look like, a sensible one?
I think it would involve sustainable high economic growth. Because then there's resources that can be allocated to environmental protection without harming the population. And certainly we should avoid the deindustrialization that's currently being implemented in Germany. That's very destructive and will have huge consequences in the future. So I think the first thing should be to have high and sustainable, equitable economic growth. And while you do this, you will see environmental protection gets easier and easier. There's, of course, the whole topic of CO2 emissions. And here, it's important, again, to work scientifically, empirically. consistently use the scientific approach. I found that this deductive, fictional economics approach is being now used by other disciplines. They use it for pandemic modeling. And they use it for climate models, where from the outset, the single biggest influence on our climate, the sun, is excluded from the analysis because the goal is to demonstrate human impact. And then if you exclude the sun from your model, it's just very unrealistic. So I think it's important to have scientifically sound climate models. Then we can really protect the environment.
Any other questions? Yes? Yes, you need one, because otherwise it's not recorded.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I have a question based on Prince of Diana. After getting familiar with the movie based on your book, there was one thing I couldn't fully comprehend, which was the window guidance in Japan. Well, how it started, where the idea really came from, and the other thing I couldn't understand very well was, did the banks, the small banks that went in pursuit of lending money, basically in the movie it's shown how banks go after people and they want to give loans. Was that the reason for the lost decade? Meaning, was that the actual reason for the crisis that have happened?
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. And they are, in fact, connected, as you realize. First of all, the history of window guidance, it was introduced by those Japanese policy makers that introduced the entire Japanese high-growth system. Because an important insight when you study Japan is, and you see in the film, it's a documentary, and they could really only focus on one dimension. If you look at the book, at quantumpublishers.com, The Princes of the Yen, what you find is I start out with an analysis of the creation of the Japanese high-growth system. Some people say, oh, it's Japanese culture, nobody else can do this. Well, they didn't have the system until 1937. They introduced it, and so what's its origin? It was based on scientific inductive economics, which was developed in opposition to English language deductive economics in Germany from the 19th century onwards. And the bureaucrats and civil servants who introduced this in Japan, they had been trained in Germany, they spoke German, and they introduced this, and that includes the role of the banking system, the creation of many local banks, and the guidance of bank credit for productive use to get high growth. Now you come to the 1980s bubble era, where the banks gave too much bank credit for unproductive asset purchases, property speculation. And that was done also through window guidance. And that's what I found. Namely, the central bank forced the banks to do this. And that answers your remaining question, because of course we need to look at cause and effect and who is behind this and who are the decision makers. It was the central bank, the Bank of Japan, that created the bubble of the 1980s, just like the ECB created the bubbles in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, and the recessions, ECB created. And that's the track record of these central planners. Then the business of creating boom-bust cycles, crises that increase their power. In the Bank of Japan's case, it was essentially US pressure on the Bank of Japan to use monetary policy to dismantle the successful high-growth system. It was so successful, how can he ever persuade the Japanese to drop that system? Well, 20 years, 25 years of intentionally prolonged recession will do it. But to do that, you had to create a manipulated banking crisis, which the central bank did. That is the shocking conclusion I had to come to reluctantly in my book, based on eyewitness testimonies, tape recorded, of central bankers, of bankers, of sources, financial sector sources, and also the data I managed to gather. And it's a very clear case and has not been disproven or even challenged since published, 20 years ago.
Thank you.
Okay. So regarding the first question that the gentleman behind my back asked, you briefly talked about how... Let me just put my thoughts together. I really hate to be on the spotlight like that.
I think you're coming to the inflation point, because when I answered that question, I was thinking of you.
I really want to get there, but first I want to, for us to confirm together that crises are created on purpose in order, as in the first question, for people in power to get more power, correct?
Well, that is a generalization. We have to be more careful. I've identified particular crises where this was what the empirical data suggest. Now, this doesn't mean that all crises are like that, but the particular ones I've examined, if you look at the central banks and also the decision-making processes, then I did come to that conclusion, yes.
Yes, and regarding the second question that was asked about the sustainability agenda, it is proven that while excluding the human and the outside factor alone, and excluding the human help to the nature itself, and just showing the bad stuff that we do, we thought that policies that are trying to, for example, ban combustion engines by year 2035, if I'm not mistaken, and pushing that agenda for electric cars and outsourcing electricity, do you think that that may be in target of complete control over the populations? Same thing goes for the 15-minute cities that the WEF are pushing for.
The electric car proposal is an interesting one, because if you do the calculations, neither now nor within the next 10 years will we have enough electricity to allow everyone who currently has a combustion engine car to switch to electric cars and then actually use those cars. In Germany, they're already saying, because they're forcing people to switch to heat exchange pumps, and you need electricity to get them going, and then people have electric cars. So now they're saying that there's too much demand already now on the electricity grid, and there's blackouts now. But of course, they want to switch even more. So the fact is, it's not possible. And that tells you, and of course with the European Union, in case you have doubts about what's going on, the shortcut is always to think of the Soviet Union. So here the shortcut is, well, what about the Soviet Union and cars? Ah, yes, the Soviet Union had cars. Yes, they had cars there, of course. Well, it was the Communist Party cadre and leadership that actually in reality had the cars, and everyone else used public transport. So that seems to be where the EU is coming from, because it's not possible for everyone to shift to electric cars. So the only reality is going to be that there will be rationing of who has a car when the combustion engine is gone. And certainly the Brussels Eurocrats, I expect, will have cars.
So that comes back to complete control over the population, am I right?
Well, central planners will centralize. At least they have this tendency, in many ways understandable. But if we don't have democratic counterweights against the central planners' centralization, we will get more centralization. And that, we've seen in the last few years, includes information flows. We now have new European laws. It's quite Orwellian in name, the freedom of media directive, which gives the European Commission the legal power to censor all social media. So, you know, we have clearly this history now of centralization of everything. And so, you know, if we don't have counterweights and don't argue against this, then it stands to reason that we will get more and more controls by fewer and fewer people. And therefore, what you're mentioning is a possibility that we should fight against.
So, coming to my point, do you think that right now, with the current situation in the US, with the Federal Reserve constantly raising the debt ceiling and constantly issuing new IOUs, do you think that may purposefully push down the house of cards they were building for so long?
It's certainly a possibility we have to consider, because the other reason why a lot of economists get surprised by events is, or observers, analysts get surprised, is because we always assume that the decision makers want what they say, which is stable high growth and prosperity and stable prices, stable currency, stable growth, stable everything. Central bankers always talk about stability. Well, there's no empirical evidence that they ever delivered this. So one has to be a bit doubtful, and therefore one has to be aware that there could be other agendas, and in particular instances, the empirical evidence shows we have cases where there was an intentional creation or exacerbation of a crisis. So that possibility exists. We have to be aware of that. Now, when it comes to the Federal Reserve and recent policies, I looked at this in 2020, and it was really shocking what they did in 2020. In March 2020, the Federal Reserve implemented my quantitative easing proposal, the second type I'd recommended for deflationary Japan, shrinking economy, negative GDP deflation. To quickly boost the economy, a central bank can create money and pump it into the economy through the banking system, while by the central bank purchasing assets from non-banks. And the Fed, I mean, central banks do this very rarely. The Bank of Japan claimed for decades, we don't know what this guy's talking about. We can't do that. No, no, no. Well, March 2020, they all knew how to do it, and they did it, but at a scale unprecedented. When there was no deflation, quite the opposite. They were restricting supply and then boosting already significant demand massively further. So I want in my tweets already from May 2020 that 18 months later we're likely to get significant inflation because of this massive expansion by the Fed and also aligned central banks that basically are in the American sphere of influence. They have to do what the Fed tells them. That includes the Bank of Japan. But it seems also the ECB is in that sphere of influence. And so these central banks create a lot of money. And yeah, that's why we've had inflation. So that is already a matter of public record, what they've done. So it's reasonable to be concerned about that further happening in the future. At the moment, I mean, looking at the past data, they've been tightening. So the Fed has been tightening in quantity terms already for over a year. Interest rates follow economic growth empirically, so it's clear that they will come down because economic growth will come down drastically in the coming year. And so they've done it once again, create a boom-bust cycle. That's the immediate outlook.
One more question, yes?
First of all, congratulations for the directive fellowship for organizing this meeting, this very special lecture, Professor Werner. I'm very satisfied with the lecture, Professor Werner. You brought a lot of theory in the lecture. You mentioned several times different countries, including Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, China. even more, but no one's Bulgarian. There's some discrepancy I see between the theme of the lecture and the reality of the lecture. No one time to mention Bulgaria. Maybe for time to give some special, simple, practical steps how to improve our economy, Bulgarian economy, without axioms, without assumptions.
Yes, exactly.
Declaration. Just 3 steps. Maybe it is to use sequentially the 3 banking theory or something else. It depends on you. Several. 1,
Yes.
2, 3, several simple, practical steps. How to Bulgaria to improve the economy?
Thank you, and that's a wonderful question to ask. I think it will really round off this discussion. Step 1, create new local banks across Bulgaria. Maybe start with a dozen, but double it to 24, maybe then have another dozen. And these should be local banks that are only allowed to lend in their local area. They're headquartered locally, and they only lend in their geographically restricted area. They will lend to small firms. They will therefore generate money, because banks create money, for productive business investment. They will have a focus on the green box, productive business investment, not asset loans or property loans, and not consumer loans, but business loans for local firms in their area. And by doing that, you will create a lot of jobs in the villages, in the towns across the country, and you will enable people to stay in the villages. They don't have to go to the big city, they don't have to go abroad. There will be job creation there, and that addresses already a lot of the problems, or improves the situation, because you get more economic growth, you get a trend towards decentralization, allowing people to stay in the villages, making it attractive in the villages, because companies can be created and set up newly in the villages. They can hire there because they get money there. That will attract people. And of course, the government will benefit in many ways, and therefore the whole nation will benefit. There will be tax revenues. The fiscal situation will improve. And there can be also loans for exports, so you can increase the international competitiveness. Because if you look at the German very successful small firms out in the countryside, their number one competitive advantage to small firms in the UK, in France, or other countries, is that they have these local banks. That if there is a good reason, such as a new technology in their industry, they will immediately get the money to buy that technology and implement it. So that would be step number 1. Step number 2, this is more a longer term issue that many countries face, is fertility and population. It's good for a country to have more people, but they should be domestically generated, so to speak. Historically, that clearly makes sense. Well, we can encourage fertility. First of all, by already having this decentralized banking structure, that creates more opportunities for families. If they can have a house in the village, they don't have to go to the city. They can have a bigger house, they can have more children. It makes suddenly commercially, financially, makes more sense. But on top of that, it's very easy to encourage the birth of children. Did you know that every new person that comes into the world, into the country, through their life, will actually deliver a lot of tax revenue, an enormous amount of tax revenue. Looking at the UK, using that data, it was on average, 880,000 pounds in tax revenue. That's a lot, almost $1 million. Mostly through VAT, transaction taxes. Income tax is actually not the dominant factor. So it makes sense, even if you use fiscal stimulation, to give a baby bonus to mothers for a newborn baby of 200,000 euros, 300,000 euros. Why not? You know, it's like working for Goldman Sachs. If you've got a little one, you have to work night and day, you know, in the initial phase. Goldman Sachs pays 200,000, so hey, you know. But actually, it's even better than that because you don't have to use tax money. This should be newly created money by the central bank, baby QE. And if you do that, you will see the fertility rate goes through the roof if you do that. So that, you know, there are incentive policies, also tax credits in Hungary. At the fourth baby, the mother becomes a tax haven. For life, no more taxes. And the third policy would probably be some type of concrete, very simple industrial policy where you encourage particular industries that are sustainable, environmentally sustainable, but can easily be either newly introduced to Hungary, to Bulgaria, or can be much bigger than they currently are. So you look at different industries and you can encourage them. And again, you can use the window guidance, which you can easily introduce, to then grow these industries, which will benefit everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much. By the way, can you think that it's the nostrum, the philosopher's stone is the local bank nation, the local banks, small local banks? Okay?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you all. First of all, thanks to Richard for being with us all day and sharing his inspiring lecture. And I think everyone will reflect on it in the following days. We'll be seeing Richard more and more in the coming year. And we wish him lots of luck with his new master program. And we are very excited about it, waiting impatiently to start it. And I think that's all for today. Thanks a lot for your contribution, and have a nice holiday, because it's a holiday.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the rector and to everyone, and also my colleague Plamen Ivanov. Dr. Ivanov, for all his contributions and collaboration in the Masters. Thank you.
The impression that economy was a science. I'm not so sure anymore. Thank you very much. It was really, really incredible.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you.